June 1958. The intersection of 135th Street and 7th Avenue in Harlem was a commercial and social center where multiple streams of neighborhood life converged. People shopping at stores that lined the streets, residents standing in small groups discussing community affairs, workers moving between jobs or heading home after shifts, children navigating between school and recreational activities. On weekday mornings in early summer, the area carried the particular energy of an urban neighborhood where economic activity, social relationships, and daily routines created complex patterns of movement that outsiders struggled to understand, but that residents navigated intuitively through years of accumulated knowledge about who belonged, where, and when. At 9:15 on this particular Thursday morning in mid-June, Robert Mitchell sat in a parked car on the east side of 7th Avenue, approximately 100 feet south of the intersection with 135th Street. Robert was 34 years old, a white man who operated a small private investigation firm in Midtown Manhattan, conducting surveillance, background checks, and insurance fraud investigations for corporate clients, law firms, and occasionally for individuals who needed information about spouses, business partners, or competitors. And he dressed in plain clothes that would not attract attention: dark trousers, a light-colored shirt, no tie, shoes that were comfortable for extended periods of sitting or walking. He carried a notebook, a camera with a telephoto lens, and binoculars, standard tools for surveillance work. Robert had been hired 3 days earlier by a client who identified himself only as Mr. and Williams, and who had paid cash in advance for 2 weeks of surveillance on Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, known throughout Harlem as Bumpy Johnson, who controlled the neighborhood's numbers rackets and maintained significant influence over various forms of commerce, both legal and illegal. The client had provided a photograph of Johnson, a description of his usual locations and patterns, and specific instructions to document Johnson's movements, meetings, associates, and activities with sufficient detail to establish comprehensive understanding of how Johnson's operations functioned. Robert had conducted surveillance on Johnson for 3 days so far: Tuesday, Wednesday, and now Thursday morning. The work had been straightforward compared to other assignments Robert had handled. Johnson maintained regular patterns, visiting the same locations at predictable times, meeting with the same associates at cafes and social clubs, conducting business openly in public spaces where surveillance from a vehicle or from strategic positions on sidewalks provided clear observation. Robert had filled multiple pages in his notebook with details about times, locations, people Johnson met with, duration of meetings, and observations about the nature of interactions. As Robert sat in his parked car on this Thursday morning, Johnson emerged from a barber shop on 135th Street, where he had apparently been getting a haircut. Johnson was 52 years old, a black man of average height, who dressed carefully in well-tailored suits despite the warm June weather. He walked south on 7th Avenue, moving at a steady pace that suggested specific destination rather than casual stroll. Robert started his car and followed at a distance of approximately 200 feet, maintaining visual contact while trying to remain inconspicuous among the other vehicles moving along 7th Avenue. Johnson walked 3 blocks south to 132nd Street, then turned east and entered a restaurant called Thompson's Cafe. Robert parked his car on 7th Avenue and walked to a location on 132nd Street where he could observe the restaurant entrance while appearing to be waiting for someone or simply taking a break from walking. He positioned himself near a newsstand where he could purchase a newspaper and could stand reading it while maintaining line of sight to Thompson's Cafe. After approximately 45 minutes, Johnson emerged from the restaurant accompanied by two men whom Robert did not recognize, but whose faces he photographed using his camera concealed inside a folded newspaper. Johnson and the two men spoke briefly on the sidewalk, then separated, Johnson walking back west toward 7th Avenue, the two men walking east toward Lenox Avenue. Robert followed Johnson, maintaining the same distance and attempting to remain unnoticed in the moderate pedestrian traffic that filled Harlem's sidewalks during mid-morning hours. What Robert did not know was that Johnson had been aware of the surveillance since it began on Tuesday morning. Johnson had decades of experience navigating environments where police, rival criminal organizations, and various other interests maintained surveillance on him, and he had developed sophisticated awareness of the patterns that indicated someone was conducting observation. The same car appearing in multiple locations, the same person standing or sitting in positions that provided sightlines to Johnson's activities, the small adjustments in timing and positioning that surveillance required, all of these created patterns that Johnson had trained himself to recognize. Johnson had noticed Robert's vehicle on Tuesday morning, parked on 138th Street near Johnson's apartment building, had observed the same vehicle later that day near a social club Johnson visited, and had identified the pattern by Tuesday evening. Rather than confronting Robert or attempting to evade the surveillance, Johnson had decided to continue his regular activities while observing the surveillance to understand who had hired it and what intelligence they were seeking. Johnson's approach to surveillance was based on understanding that people conducting observation revealed information through their choices about what to document and how to react to different activities. By maintaining normal patterns while observing what the surveillance focused on, Johnson could understand what the client who hired the surveillance considered important, which would provide clues about who the client was and what their objectives were. Over the 3 days Robert had been following Johnson, Johnson had varied his activities slightly to test what aspects of his operations the surveillance prioritized. On Tuesday, Johnson had spent time at locations associated with his numbers operations, meeting with runners, visiting collection sites, speaking with people who manage different aspects of the business. Robert had documented all of this carefully, suggesting the client was interested in understanding the operational structure of Johnson's organization. On Wednesday, Johnson had spent time at locations associated with his social and community activities, visiting residents who needed assistance with rent or other expenses, speaking with business owners about neighborhood affairs, meeting with community leaders about local issues. Robert had continued documenting, but with less apparent interest, suggesting these activities were considered less important by the client. On Thursday, Johnson had mixed both types of activities, and Robert's documentation had focused primarily on the meetings that appeared to be business-related rather than on the community activities. This confirmed for Johnson that the client was specifically interested in understanding Johnson's criminal operations rather than his broader activities in Harlem. This pattern of focus suggested several possible clients, and it could be law enforcement, police, or federal agents seeking evidence for criminal prosecution. It could be rival criminal interests seeking intelligence to identify vulnerabilities in Johnson's operations. It could be Italian mob families attempting to understand Johnson's organization better to inform decisions about whether to maintain the 1935 profit-sharing agreement or to attempt more direct control. Ed Johnson needed to identify which of these possibilities was correct before deciding how to respond to the surveillance. If it was law enforcement, Johnson needed to be aware of what evidence was being compiled and needed to adjust operations accordingly. If it was rival criminals, Johnson needed to understand what challenge they were planning and needed to prepare defenses. If it was Italian mob families, Johnson needed to understand what questions they had about his operations and needed to consider whether to address those questions directly or to let the surveillance continue collecting information that reinforced Johnson's position. To identify who had hired Robert Mitchell, Johnson began building a network of information sources and strategic allies who could help investigate the surveillance while Johnson continued being followed. The first person Johnson contacted was Thomas Bradley, an attorney who handled legal matters for Johnson's organization and who had connections throughout New York's legal community. Johnson asked Bradley to determine whether any law enforcement agencies had recently hired private investigators for surveillance work in Harlem, whether any civil litigation involving Johnson or his associates was pending that might explain the need for surveillance, and whether Bradley's contacts in the legal community had heard about any investigations or proceedings that would create demand for intelligence about Johnson's operations. Bradley conducted inquiries through his network over the following 2 days and reported that he found no evidence of law enforcement involvement in surveillance on Johnson, no pending litigation that would explain the need for private investigation, and no indication that courts or prosecutors were actively investigating Johnson's current activities. This information suggested the surveillance was not law enforcement related, which narrowed the possibilities to rival criminals or Italian mob families. The second person Johnson contacted was Marcus Williams, a numbers runner who worked for Johnson's organization and who had extensive street-level connections throughout Harlem's criminal networks. Johnson asked Marcus to determine whether any new criminal operators had appeared in Harlem recently, whether any existing operators had been asking questions about Johnson's organization, and whether any unusual activities suggested someone was planning to challenge Johnson's control over numbers operations. Marcus conducted inquiries through his network and reported that he found no evidence of new operators establishing presence in Harlem, no indication that existing operators were gathering intelligence about Johnson's organization, and no unusual activities that suggested challenges were being planned. This information suggested the surveillance was not connected to rival criminals in Harlem, which further narrowed the possibilities. The third person Johnson contacted was Meyer Lansky, the Jewish organized crime figure who maintained extensive connections with Italian mob families and who had worked with Johnson on various ventures over the years. Johnson explained to Lansky that he was under surveillance by a private investigator and that the investigation appeared to focus on understanding Johnson's operational structure. Johnson asked whether Lansky had heard about any discussions within Italian mob families about renegotiating or eliminating the 1935 agreement that governed Harlem operations. Lansky conducted inquiries through his connections and reported that there had been recent discussions within the Genovese family about whether the 1935 agreement was still serving family interests optimally, but that these discussions had not reached the level of formal proposals or decisions. Lansky indicated that some younger capos within the Genovese family had been expressing interest in understanding Johnson's operations better to evaluate whether different arrangements might generate higher profits, but that senior leadership had not authorized any specific actions. And this information suggested that the surveillance was likely connected to these internal Genovese family discussions. Someone within the organization had hired private investigation to gather intelligence that would inform their arguments about whether to maintain or change the arrangements with Johnson. This client was probably operating somewhat independently rather than with full authorization from family leadership, which explained why the surveillance was being conducted by a private investigator rather than by Genovese family associates who would be more familiar with Harlem and with Johnson's operations. Understanding who the likely client was helped Johnson develop a strategy for how to respond to the surveillance. Rather than simply evading it or confronting Robert Mitchell directly, Johnson decided to use the surveillance as an opportunity to communicate specific information to whoever had hired it. By controlling what Robert documented during the surveillance, Johnson could shape what intelligence the client received, which would influence how the client interpreted Johnson's operations and what conclusions they drew about whether different arrangements were feasible. Johnson's strategy had several components that would unfold over the remaining days of the 2-week surveillance period that the client had apparently paid for. And the first component involved continuing normal activities, but emphasizing aspects of Johnson's operations that demonstrated organizational strength and community integration. Johnson scheduled meetings with key lieutenants in his organization at locations where Robert could observe and document them, creating the impression of a well-structured hierarchy with clear roles and responsibilities. Johnson also scheduled visible community activities, distributing food to families in need, and meeting with ministers and community leaders, visiting businesses to discuss neighborhood affairs, that demonstrated Johnson's deep integration into Harlem's social fabric. These activities were authentic rather than staged. Johnson regularly conducted both his criminal operations and his community activities, but by being strategic about timing and location, Johnson ensured that Robert documented a comprehensive picture of both aspects of Johnson's position in Harlem. And the message this created was that Johnson's control came not just from criminal capacity, but from community relationships that made his position extremely difficult to challenge or replace. The second component involved subtle demonstrations of Johnson's awareness and intelligence capabilities. On the 6th day of surveillance, Tuesday of the second week, Johnson deliberately led Robert on a route through Harlem that passed by several locations where Johnson's associates were positioned and aware that Johnson was being followed. These associates made no obvious acknowledgement of the surveillance, but their positioning and their observation of Robert created a situation where Robert would realize, if he was perceptive, that Johnson was being protected by a network that extended far beyond what visible meetings with lieutenants would suggest. Johnson also began making small changes to his routes and timing that did not prevent Robert from maintaining surveillance, but that demonstrated Johnson was controlling the conditions under which surveillance occurred. For instance, Johnson would pause at intersections slightly longer than normal traffic flow required, creating opportunities for Robert to position himself. Or Johnson would choose walking routes that provided multiple observation points, making Robert's work easier in ways that suggested Johnson was aware of being followed and was choosing to allow it rather than being unaware of it. The third component involved having Thomas Bradley determine Robert Mitchell's identity and background. Bradley hired a different private investigator to follow Robert when Robert was not conducting surveillance on Johnson, and to document where Robert's office was located, who his associates were, and what his patterns suggested about his professional practices. Within 3 days, Bradley's investigator had identified Robert as a Midtown private investigator who specialized in routine surveillance and background checks, who operated independently rather than as part of a larger firm, and who had no apparent criminal connections that would suggest he was conducting surveillance for reasons beyond being hired by a paying client. This information confirmed that Robert was simply a professional doing a job he had been hired for, which meant confronting or intimidating Robert would not address the underlying situation and might create complications with law enforcement if Robert reported threats or intimidation. The appropriate response was to continue allowing the surveillance while ensuring it collected information that served Johnson's strategic interests. The fourth component involved strategic communications through Meyer Lansky to Genovese family leadership. Lansky communicated to senior figures in the Genovese organization that Johnson was aware he was under surveillance by a private investigator, that Johnson had chosen to allow the surveillance to continue rather than evading or stopping it, and that Johnson was interested in understanding what questions the surveillance was intended to answer so that Johnson could address those questions directly if that would serve mutual interests. Lansky's communication was carefully calibrated. It did not accuse anyone of improper action, did not threaten consequences, and did not demand that surveillance stop. Instead, it simply informed Genovese leadership that Johnson knew about the surveillance and was interpreting it as a sign that someone had questions about whether current arrangements remained optimal. Lansky suggested that if the Genovese family had such questions, direct communication might be more productive than surveillance, because surveillance could only document visible activities and could not explain the strategic reasoning behind Johnson's operational choices. This communication served multiple purposes. It informed Genovese leadership that surveillance was occurring, which they might not have known if it was unauthorized freelancing by a lower-level member. It demonstrated Johnson's confidence and lack of concern about being observed, which reinforced his position. It created an opening for direct negotiation if Genovese leadership wanted to discuss arrangements, which would be preferable to having decisions made based on incomplete intelligence gathered through surveillance. By the 10th day of surveillance, Thursday of the second week, several developments indicated that Johnson's strategy was having effects. First, Robert Mitchell had begun showing signs of awareness that his surveillance was not as covert as he had believed when it started. The strategic positioning of Johnson's associates, the deliberate routes Johnson chose, the small timing adjustments Johnson made, all of these created patterns that suggested Johnson knew he was being followed and was controlling conditions rather than being observed unknowingly. Robert's note-taking became less detailed, as he apparently recognized that documenting activities Johnson was deliberately displaying served little intelligence purpose. Second, Johnson began receiving indirect communication through Lansky that Genovese family leadership had become aware of the surveillance and was investigating who had authorized it without proper approval. Senior leadership was concerned that unauthorized intelligence gathering could create problems with Johnson that would destabilize the profitable arrangements that had existed since 1935, and they wanted to understand what questions had motivated the surveillance so they could determine whether those questions were legitimate concerns or just ambitious freelancing by someone who wanted to justify proposals for change. Third, word circulated through Harlem's informal communication networks that Bumpy Johnson was being followed by a private investigator, and that Johnson was aware of it and was choosing to allow it to continue. This circulation of information created community awareness that served as a form of protection. If anything happened to Johnson while under surveillance, the private investigator would immediately be suspected and investigated, which created additional deterrent against the surveillance being connected to any harmful intentions. On the 14th day of surveillance, Monday of the third week, Robert Mitchell arrived at his usual observation position near Johnson's apartment building, but did not begin his normal documentation routine. Instead, he sat in his car for approximately 30 minutes, apparently considering whether to continue the surveillance now that he recognized Johnson was aware of it and that the surveillance was documenting only what Johnson chose to display. At 10 o'clock, Johnson emerged from his apartment building and walked directly to Robert's parked car. Johnson stood next to the driver's side window and waited until Robert rolled down the window. Johnson then said that he understood Robert was conducting professional work for a paying client, that Robert had conducted himself appropriately throughout the surveillance, and that Johnson was not concerned about Robert's presence or activities. Johnson suggested that if Robert's client had questions about Johnson's operations or about whether current arrangements in Harlem remained optimal, direct communication would answer those questions more accurately than surveillance could provide. Johnson then walked away, continuing his normal route toward his first destination of the day. Robert sat in his car, processing what had just occurred. The calm, direct communication, without threats, without confrontation, but without any attempt to stop the surveillance, was more unsettling than intimidation would have been because it demonstrated complete confidence and control. Johnson had known about the surveillance from the beginning, had allowed it to continue while controlling what it documented, and was now directly acknowledging it without any concern about consequences. Robert started his car and drove back to his office in Midtown Manhattan. He did not follow Johnson or attempt to continue the surveillance, and he had been hired for 2 weeks, and the 2 weeks had now passed. But more importantly, Robert recognized that continuing documentation served no intelligence purpose when the subject was aware of the surveillance and was controlling what was observed. Robert prepared a final report for his client summarizing what he had documented over the 2-week period. But he included a note explaining that the subject had been aware of the surveillance throughout and that the information gathered should be understood as what the subject chose to display rather than as covert intelligence. Robert indicated that in his professional judgment, continuing surveillance would not produce additional useful information and might create complications if the subject decided to address it more directly. Robert attempted to deliver this report to Mr. Williams at the contact information that had been provided when the job was hired, But the phone number was disconnected, and the address turned out to be a mail forwarding service with no information about the client's actual location. This suggested the client had deliberately obscured their identity, which was not unusual for surveillance work, but which made follow-up communication impossible. Over the following weeks, Johnson learned through Meyer Lansky's continuing communications with Genovese family leadership that the person who had hired Robert Mitchell had been identified as a relatively junior capo named Vincent Corso, who had been advocating for renegotiating the 1935 arrangement without having authorization to gather intelligence or to initiate such discussions. Genovese family leadership had disciplined Corso for freelancing beyond his authority and had reaffirmed to Johnson through Lansky that the family valued the existing arrangements and had no intention of disrupting them based on unauthorized intelligence gathering by ambitious subordinates. The resolution of the surveillance incident created several outcomes that extended beyond just stopping Robert Mitchell's documentation. First, and it established that Johnson's awareness and control extended to detecting and managing surveillance that most subjects would not notice until much later, if at all. The fact that Johnson had recognized the surveillance immediately and had chosen to allow it while controlling what was documented demonstrated sophisticated counter-surveillance capabilities that made attempts to gather intelligence about Johnson's operations much more difficult and less reliable. Second, it demonstrated Johnson's strategic patience and restraint. Rather than confronting or threatening Robert Mitchell, rather than evading the surveillance, rather than escalating to conflict with whoever hired it, Johnson had simply allowed it to continue while shaping what intelligence was gathered and while investigating who had hired it and why. This approach achieved better outcomes than confrontation would have. It provided intelligence about who was asking questions and why. It avoided creating the kind of incident that could destabilize relationships with Genovese family leadership, and it demonstrated confidence that reinforced Johnson's position. Third, it created deterrent effects for future attempts to gather intelligence about Johnson's operations. The story of the surveillance and how Johnson had managed it circulated through criminal networks, creating understanding that attempting covert intelligence gathering on Johnson was likely to be detected and was likely to produce information that Johnson controlled rather than genuine intelligence. This made such attempts less attractive to anyone considering them. Fourth, it reinforced to Genovese family leadership that Johnson was someone who operated at a level of strategic sophistication that commanded respect. The way Johnson had handled the surveillance, recognizing it immediately, allowing it to continue strategically, investigating who hired it, communicating about it constructively, demonstrated capabilities that suggested attempting to impose control on Johnson or his operations would be extremely difficult and would likely fail. This reinforcement of respect served Johnson's interests better than any specific negotiation or confrontation could have achieved. For Robert Mitchell, the experience affected how he approached subsequent surveillance assignments. He became more cautious about assuming subjects were unaware of being followed, more attentive to signs that subjects might be controlling what surveillance documented, and more inclined to include caveats in his reports about the limitations of what surveillance could reveal when subjects were sophisticated enough to detect and manage it. Robert never learned definitively who Mr. Williams was or what happened after he delivered his final report with its note about the subject's awareness. But the fact that he was never contacted again by that client, the fact that he never received subsequent assignments involving Harlem or Bumpy Johnson, and the fact that other private investigators in his network mentioned hearing about Johnson's reputation for detecting surveillance, all of these suggested that his client had received the message that surveillance on Johnson was not productive and that other approaches would be necessary if intelligence about Johnson's operations was actually needed. For Thomas Bradley, the attorney who had helped Johnson investigate who hired the surveillance, and the incident reinforced lessons about the importance of counterintelligence as part of protecting criminal operations. Bradley noted in subsequent conversations with Johnson that the surveillance had represented a vulnerability. If it had been law enforcement rather than a freelancing Genovese capo, the 2 weeks of documentation could have provided evidence for prosecution. Bradley suggested developing more systematic counter-surveillance procedures that would detect observation earlier and would create regular protocols for investigating and addressing it. Johnson acknowledged Bradley's concern, but noted that the vulnerability also created opportunities. Surveillance revealed who was interested in Johnson's operations and what aspects they focused on, which provided intelligence that was valuable for strategic planning. The key was detecting surveillance early enough to control what was documented and to investigate who was conducting it, which Johnson's experience and awareness had made possible in this instance. For Meyer Lansky, who had served as intermediary between Johnson and Genovese family leadership throughout the incident, the situation demonstrated why maintaining direct communication channels between criminal organizations served everyone's interests better than allowing unauthorized intelligence gathering or freelance initiatives by ambitious subordinates. Lansky noted in subsequent conversations with Genovese leadership that the Corso incident could have created serious problems if Johnson had responded with confrontation rather than with strategic patience, and that the family should be more careful about preventing unauthorized activities that could destabilize valuable relationships. For Harlem's community, the story of the private investigator who followed Bumpy Johnson and stopped taking notes became part of the neighborhood's understanding of Johnson's capabilities and position. The story was told with various interpretations, some emphasizing Johnson's awareness and intelligence, others emphasizing his confidence and lack of fear, and still others emphasizing the respect he commanded from Italian mob families. But all versions of the story reinforced the perception that Johnson was not someone whose operations could be easily understood or whose position could be easily challenged, because his awareness extended to detecting surveillance, and his strategic thinking allowed him to turn even being watched into opportunities for demonstrating strength. The incident influenced how Johnson approached his operations in subsequent years. He became more systematic about counter-surveillance, regularly varying routes and timing to make surveillance more difficult, positioning associates to observe whether anyone was conducting observation on him, and maintaining awareness of vehicles and individuals who appeared in multiple locations. These practices became standard procedures for his organization, and with lieutenants trained to watch for surveillance and to report signs of observation so that Johnson could investigate and address it before it produced useful intelligence for whoever was conducting it. When Johnson died in July 1968, 10 years after the Robert Mitchell surveillance incident, the obituaries and tributes included references to his reputation for awareness and intelligence that made him extremely difficult to surprise or to gather information about covertly. And the surveillance incident was one of many examples that contributed to this reputation, demonstrating that Johnson's power came not just from controlling operations, but from sophisticated understanding of how information flowed and how to manage what others could learn about his activities. The story of the private investigator who stopped taking notes became emblematic of a principle that extended beyond just Johnson's specific situation, that awareness and strategic patience could defeat intelligence gathering more effectively than evasion or confrontation, that allowing observation while controlling what was observed could serve defensive purposes better than preventing observation altogether, and that understanding who was seeking information and why created opportunities for addressing their concerns constructively or for demonstrating that attempts to gather intelligence would not produce useful results. The quiet nature of how Johnson had managed the surveillance, no dramatic confrontation with Robert Mitchell, no threats, no attempts to stop the documentation, just calm awareness and strategic control over what was documented demonstrated that the most effective exercises of power often occurred through processes that were invisible to outside observers. Most people in Harlem knew only that a private investigator had followed Johnson and had stopped, but they did not know about the investigation of who hired the surveillance, the strategic shaping of what was documented, the communications through Lansky to Genovese leadership, or the ultimate outcome of Corso being disciplined. The absence of visible drama did not mean absence of strategic action. It meant that strategic action was occurring at levels that most observers could not perceive. Decades after the incident, when criminologists studied counter-surveillance and counterintelligence in urban criminal organizations, some referenced stories like Johnson's management of the Mitchell surveillance as examples of how sophisticated operators approached information security. The key lesson was that detecting surveillance early created options that were not available if surveillance continued undetected until it had gathered significant intelligence. Early detection allowed controlling what was documented, investigating who was conducting and who had commissioned the surveillance, and in addressing the underlying concerns or demonstrating that surveillance would not produce useful results. The legacy of the incident was that Johnson's reputation for awareness and control was reinforced through demonstration rather than through claims. Rather than simply being known as someone who claimed to be aware of everything happening in Harlem, Johnson became known as someone who had actually detected surveillance that most people would not have noticed, and who had managed it in ways that demonstrated strategic sophistication. This reputation had practical effects. It made people more cautious about attempting covert actions against Johnson, more inclined to communicate directly rather than gathering intelligence surreptitiously, and more respectful of Johnson's capabilities when considering how to interact with his operations.